Thank you so much, Bill, for that introduction. This is Clara, and just to give you a sense of what we will be covering in today's webinar, Sarah and I will give you a little bit of background on urban forests and natural areas and the science of forests and cities. And then, as Bill said, provide some context for a workshop where we connected with practitioners from across the U.S., specifically in 12 cities, and then introduce the 25 case studies about the management of urban forests and natural areas in cities. And then we'll hand it off to Rich to discuss the urban silvicultural framework and urban and rural learning opportunities. So I'll hand it over to Sarah now to set the stage for what we'll be discussing. So before we spend a whole hour talking about urban forested natural areas, I thought I would just provide a little introduction to why we are using this term, urban forested natural areas, and not the term urban forest or another term. So in cities, if you've visited cities, if you live in a city, you're of course familiar with trees growing in a lot of different environments, on the street, in the backyard, in landscaped parks. And forested natural areas are these areas that are less designed and really occur in stands, a collection of stands, and are sort of the woods that you would find in cities. But it can be kind of confusing when we say urban forests and if we're really talking about urban forested natural areas. So the urban forest, just to give the definition, really includes all trees growing in an urban environment. So together it includes street trees, backyard trees, and park trees, as well as forested natural areas. And so we have to distinguish these areas apart from the trees growing in more designed landscapes. So we sometimes also use the term forest in cities, urban woodlands, forest patches, but these areas are really more similar in sort of function and process as our rural forest landscape. So if you look at the definition of a forest, we're talking about trees that are growing together, that have a certain canopy closure. Sometimes there's some stocking requirements, and there's whole papers about what a forest is, and we won't get into that today, but I did want to just provide a little bit of clarity around why we're using this term and the areas that we're talking about. And so this webinar, we're really focused on forested natural areas and forest patches, forest woodlands, so these areas that are growing together and look like the woods. So we have a few pictures just to visualize this. So this is a forest in the Bronx in New York City in Van Cortlandt Park. Here's a forest in Seattle, Washington, Indianapolis, and Jacksonville, Florida. And so there can be a lot of different conditions. Oh, also Minneapolis, Minnesota. The forested natural areas and natural areas in cities are actually a big resource. 84% of city parkland in the 100 most populous cities in the U.S. Are natural areas. And so natural areas is a dominant type of parkland, and that even as someone that has worked in natural areas for over 10 years, really surprised us. And in the 100 most populous cities, in those same cities, 64 million people live adjacent and use or could use these forests as a form of nearby nature. And so they have an incredible ability to be the forest that city residents can experience. And even in New York City, we actually found that to be true. A study by the Forest Service in New York City found that 50% of New Yorkers reported only recreating in New York City parkland. And so parkland in cities provides incredible opportunities to recreate, hike, bird, and I think of recent, during the pandemic, we've seen people really using our parkland and really finding solace and respite in these parts of our cities. And so it's a bigger resource than we thought, and a lot of people use these forests and parkland. However, a study that I've been working on recently using some data from Trust for Public Land has found that just in 5 years, in those same 100 most populous cities, we've lost almost 40,000 acres of natural area parkland. And so cities are growing at a rapid rate. Urban natural area parkland can sometimes also be areas that are poised for development. And so local conservation measures and protections are critical to protecting this resource. And just to give a little bit of context and sort of zoom into an individual city, so the city where I work, New York City, we have over 10,000 acres of natural area forests, and the majority of those forests are found on New York City Park property. At the same time, forested natural areas only account for about a quarter of the total tree canopy, so 25% of the tree canopy, but the majority of trees. And so we have 65% of all of the trees in the city are found in natural areas, and 69% of the carbon stored in trees in all of New York City is found in natural area forests. And in a separate study, we also found that the composition of natural area forests are predominantly native and more similar to rural forest types, and really different than street trees. And so street trees have had a lower proportion of native species. And so the composition and structure of forested natural areas can really vary. So you could have an invasive vineland like you see on the left, pretty homogeneous, or you could have a native oak forest like you see on the right. And in cities, when we manage forests and we study them, we really value these native habitats because they can provide a lot more benefits socially and ecologically than the invaded forest. And so that's sort of the crux of what we're going to be talking about today, is sort of the management and care of forested natural areas. And so ensuring healthy forests in cities really requires protection, management, and partnership. And so when you look at this diagram, and there's sort of two paths here. And so urban areas can have or be subjected to a ton of different stressors, fragmentation, historical land use. And so to really get those desired native forests, we have to really think about management systems and approaches for management. So I think now I'm going to hand it back to Phil to do a poll of the audience. Yeah, this is Clara. So I'll now walk you through the themes of the workshop and the case studies in a few vignettes. So the way that we structured the engagement with these 12 cities was really focused on having a outcome. And so we partnered with the journal Cities and the Environment to create a special issue where they have a practitioner format for articles. And so each of the city teams had at least 3 people on them from typically city government, a nonprofit, and then a policy or planning member. And each team was then asked to create 2 case studies around one of these 8 themes. And these 8 themes we sort of structured in terms of the nuts and bolts of management. So sort of the first 4 there: assessment, planning, or these aren't actually in order, but assessment, prioritization and planning, innovations in restoration and management, and monitoring are sort of the nuts and bolts of a management system. And then other really important themes in the urban environment, such as climate change adaptation, organizing and engaging with the community, partnering with members across different sectors, so public health, transportation, and then urban land preservation and policy, so thinking about how natural areas are really regulated locally and thinking about, development and sort of how do we protect and conserve natural areas. And so all of the case studies were written under one of these 8 themes, and then during our workshop, we discussed those case studies. So yeah, like I said, there's a publication in Cities and the Environment, and we'll share the link. It was published in March of 2020. And yeah, definitely would encourage people that are interested in more details about natural areas or seeing some of the different techniques to check it out. So I'm going to share 3 of the case studies and just sort of give you a few bullet points just to give you a sense of sort of the types of things that they cover. So the first one I'll share is from the city of St. Louis. And this was under the theme of innovations in restoration and management. And this case study was really interesting because they took the challenge of having kind of ecologically, the forest was in a typical sort of state for an urban forest. There were invasive species. It was over-mature. And they really reached into their toolbox and came up with a lot of innovative approaches. And so in this case study, they described the strategies they used to improve the health of their forest, and they drew from a lot of really traditional practices. So they did thinning for forest stand improvement, and they did prescribed burning, along with invasive species removal. And so both the thinning and the prescribed burning are 2 skills that I personally haven't seen widely used in cities. And they really cover sort of how they got the city to be okay with cutting trees down and doing a low-intensity prescribed burn. So definitely would encourage you all to check that out. The second case study that I'll briefly describe is from the city of Seattle, Washington. And this was under the theme of climate change adaptation. And in this case study, they used a pretty interesting approach where they used spatial data and field collected data to basically come up with a vulnerability and sort of risk score for the future climate conditions expected in the city. And so they came up with a ranking system and then have been exploring options for adaptation approaches to ensure their forests are healthy for the future. And so they discussed their sort of open questions at the end, and I think that was something we discussed a lot in the workshop as well, as sort of the uncertainty around some of these climate adaptation approaches. And so they kind of lay that all out there, and they have a really sophisticated management program in that city that has had a long history of advocacy and planning and prioritization and monitoring. And so they were able to really leverage those resources into kind of looking into the future and how to manage and adapt their forest for future climate conditions. And the third and final case study that I'll share is from the city of Minneapolis, Minnesota. And this was under the theme of assessment. And in this case study, they highlight sort of a 2-phase approach where they were really looking first and foremost to characterize and quantify the condition of their natural area forests. And so they used national vegetation classification systems as well as the Minnesota Natural Heritage vegetation typing, and characterized the forest condition across the city of Minneapolis. And this is with the Minneapolis Park and Rec Board. And then they went a step further and then have used local site information to inform and develop sort of a ranking system so they can do almost like a triage for their management. And so really thinking about connecting the condition on the ground, both at the city scale and at the site scale, with management recommendations. So that's also a very interesting case study that I would encourage everybody to check out. So yeah, like I said, there's 25. Those are just 3. Yeah, encourage you to reach out to the authors if you read it and you have questions. So now I'll hand it back to Sarah to give a more sort of timely context for natural areas.